Hello, everyone who has joined us. I'm so grateful that you are attending this series. Because of you, I have deepened my knowledge about race in the United States. If someone asked you, what is your race? How would you answer? Across the span of your life, might your answer have changed? Individual responses to those questions vary widely. That in itself supports the point that exploring race matters. The double meaning of the title is intentional. Exploring race is something important. It matters. Exploring race warrants looking at many issues or matters. So we will consider why race matters and will examine a variety of relevant issues. To set the stage and tone for our time together, I'm going to answer the questions I posed. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio on June 9th, 1950. Yep, 1950, okay. And I'm glad to be here. My birth certificate lists my race as N. What do you think that stands for? Well, Nubian Queen, of course. Well, actually it's Negro, which was the government label at that time. During my younger years, I considered myself colored because that's what people like me and my community called ourselves. When I was a teenager in the 1960s, my friends and I gleefully obeyed the godfather of soul. Anybody know who that is? R&B singer James Brown, also known as Soul Brother Number One, who told us to say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. The concept of Black pride was an empowering force against ways that we have been taught to dislike Blackness. I'll say more about that later. In college, I designed a poster with BLACK as an acronym for beauty, love, ability, creativity, knowledge. And because of that background, although a newer label of African American is an option, I still prefer Black. Throughout our time together, I'll tell you more about me. As I share my stories, I invite you to think about yours. This should help us to achieve my main goal for the series, to educate, encourage, and equip you to explore race matters and to figure out how to apply what you discover. Next, let's take a look at the overview for the day. So today, day one, we'll look at what is race, define race, explain how race is a social construction, describe the history of race in the United States. Also, this helps you to know what I mean by certain words. So here's a definition of race. Most definitions try to categorize people primarily by their physical differences. They refer to features such as our skin color, facial features, hair textures, body type, eye formation, etc., that we see as characteristic of a group of people. This implies that race is a real thing based on physical attributes. However, race is actually made up. As you see on the quote here, it's a social and political construction with no inherent genetic or biological basis used by social institutions to arbitrarily categorize and divide groups of individuals. Within the Human Genome Project, actually discovered as a 13-year-long US publicly funded project with the objective of determining the DNA sequence of the entire Eurochromatic human genome. Among its conclusions was that the concept of race is not grounded in genetics. In fact, the genetic difference between any two humans is less than 1%. Of course, just because race is made up does not diminish its significance, not at all. To understand how and why the concept of race became so powerful and enduring, let's look at its origins. Starting with Carl Linnaeus, who in 1758 created a classification system. And in fact, the whole notion of racial classification can be traced to the beginning of European exploration and colonization, connected with efforts to formally classify and name organisms according to their genus and species. So Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist known as the father of taxonomy. And he's famous for devising new systems for naming and grouping all living organisms. In 1735, he briefly shifted his attention from flora and fauna to focus on human beings. He divided the human species into four: Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and Europaeus. And he described them as shown on the slide. Take a look at the characteristics he attributes, and that was one of the first places where races were referred to as colors. But notice that he also listed attributes in terms of, for example, for Asiaticus, melancholic, haughty, greedy. Americans, which were the Native Americans, red, stubborn, zealous. Notice for Europeanus that there were no what I would consider as negative traits. And for Africanus, there were many of them, and many of them are ones that persist to this day. So he was one of the first. Next, you will see Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. So he's another one who was, oh, by the way, back to Carl Linnaeus, I could find no evidence in terms of what did he use to make those characteristics. On the next slide, you will see Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And Blumenbach was a naturalist. Please go to the next slide. Blumenbach was a naturalist who actually created one of the most popular classifications. And he based it on the analysis of a skull from the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. And he declared, I have allotted the first place to the Caucasian because this stock displays the most beautiful race of men. Blumenbach contended that they were the superior, most civilized race. And he said that the other races represented a degeneration from the original type. His model was widely embraced. Thus, Blumenbach inadvertently paved the way for scientific claims about white superiority. These classifications were among others that emerged in the late 18th century that helped to rationalize social inequalities and justify discriminatory policies and laws. In 1781, Thomas Jefferson was the first prominent American to suggest innate Black inferiority, writing, quote, as you will see on, writing therefore, as a suspicion only that Blacks are inferior to the whites in endowments of body and mind. As you see next, there were lots of enduring assumptions about race. From the very beginning, the anthropology of races in the modern world has gone hand in hand with notions of inferiority and superiority. This yielded a systematic, institutionalized set of beliefs and attitudes. And here are some of them. The three on this slide basically say everybody can be divided into separate races and a person can belong to only one based on visible physical differences. And anytime something came up that challenged some of these assumptions, then the scientists, and I'm putting that in quotes, found ways to justify them. So in this case, there was something they called a racial essence to explain the anomalies. Next slide, you will see that each race has distinct qualities is something they also contended, and you saw those in one of the overview for Blumenbach, right? And for Linnaeus, distinct qualities of temperament, morality, et cetera, intellectual ability. And so in the popular imagination, each race has distinct behavioral traits that are linked to its phenotype. The other thing that the assumptions include are that races are unequal and that they need to be ranked. And you see here a reference to a biologist. There were many scientists and many scientific papers, et cetera, that were published, many public figures who really helped to perpetuate this notion of race. Another one is that the attributes are inherited, innate, fixed, permanent, unalterable. And finally, that the races need to be segregated and allowed to develop everything on their own. Next slide, you will see that in her critically acclaimed book, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, legal scholar Dorothy Roberts details race as a political creation that helps to maintain white as a superior category. As one example, she cites changes in defining American racial groups across history. She asserts that those changes are not just a matter of adding or subtracting options for people to fill out on a census form. Rather, they reflect shifts in the rules the government employs to categorize people by race, and by the way, that underscore notions of white supremacy. To consider her claim, let's take a look at how the federal government has constructed race via the US Census. So the US Census in 1790 was the very first one, as directed by the US Constitution. As you see here, I typed this in so you can see exactly how it was written, including the capitalization and so forth. And so persons called enumerators counted the number of persons in each household according to these categories of free white males, free white females, all other persons, and slaves. So a fascinating article on the Census Bureau website about this process explains that most of the enumerators were US Marshals. If you take a look at the next slide, you're going to see that the notion of race has changed significantly since that first census. It now includes an ethnicity question, and then it goes on to a race question. And behind the scenes of this, some of you may know for the 2020 census that one of the proposed changes included adding a race category for Middle Eastern and North African groups. And that had been in the works for quite some time. However, it was not approved. I leave it to you, if you're not familiar with it, to do a little research in terms of what possibly happened that it was not approved. The 2020 census does ask participants who check off white and Black to also write in their origins. And among suggested answers are examples of two of the largest Middle Eastern and North African nationality groups, Lebanese and Egyptian. The current administration of the United States for 2020 planned to ask individuals if they are US citizens. You probably heard about this. This ignited fears that the information could be used to target certain groups. Government employees said, no, that won't happen because releasing such information is against the law. However, there's at least one precedent. Information from the 1940 census was secretly used in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After this violation was exposed, Kenneth Pruitt, then director of the US Census Bureau, issued a public apology. Quote, "The historical record is clear that senior Census Bureau staff proactively cooperated with the internment and that census tabulations were directly implicated in the denial of civil rights to citizens of the United States who happened also to be of Japanese ancestry," unquote. Next, I want you to understand a bit in terms of the slide, the item about ethnicity, which was in 1980, the census added ethnicity, but only for Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And I think that the newer way that Blacks and whites can indicate origin may get at ethnicity, which refers to cultural factors such as nationality, regional culture, ancestry, and language. On the next slide, you're going to see something that I encourage you to, if you haven't seen this, to go to the Census Bureau. And by the way, all of the references will be available to you at the end of the series. I've amassed quite a lot of them, and I'll have live links that you can go to them. But in the meantime, this one is a chart of race categories from 1790 to 2010. And the colors that you see represent the various racial categories. If you take a look at this, do you see which colors are constant across the whole span? I wish I missed talking and being interactive, but can you see colors that are constant? Well, they're blue and orange, and those are Black and white. And Black was changed many times while white was changed only slightly. It was not until 1960 that people could select their own race. Prior to that, an individual's race was determined by enumerators. I couldn't find instructions to enumerators about, so how did they figure out a person's racial identity? It was not until 2000 that Americans could choose more than one race to describe themselves, allowing for an estimate of the nation's multiracial population. This is a live chart, so as you hover over the various categories, Interesting information, including some old documents and so forth, will pop up. Exploring the background of census race categories reveals ways that they serve to maintain the white category as the superior. They reflect the politics and science of their times. For example, in the second half of the 19th century, census data helped to drive scientific theories of race that were used to justify racial discrimination. Prominent among these was eugenics, meaning good genes, to emphasize heredity as the cause of all human behavioral and cultural differences. To paraphrase a quote from the PBS's website, quote, eugenicists advocated selective breeding to engineer the ideal society. Their writings found a receptive audience among white intellectuals in the early 20th century and profoundly influenced many aspects of American life, including immigration policy, anti-miscegenation laws, involuntary sterilization, and schooling. Although the American eugenics movement collapsed by World War II, its effect on institutions and social policy is long-lasting, finding its fruition in Nazi Germany. In 1890, the census added quadroons and octoroons as categories under the race category. So enumerators were instructed to write white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian. Those were the categories then, according to the color or race of the person enumerated. The instructions go on to say, be particularly careful to distinguish between blacks, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons. The word black should be described those who have 3/4 or more black blood, mulatto, and it goes on in terms of percentage of black blood. So you've probably heard of the one drop rule. Next slide. That is a social and legal principle of racial classification that was historically prominent in the United States in the 20th century. It asserted that any person with even one ancestor of Black ancestry, therefore the one drop of Black blood, is considered Black, or at that time, Negro or colored. From the early 1700s and 1800s up to the late 1900s, who was Black or white was a matter of state laws. You could be Black in one state, but when you cross the state line, you would no longer be considered Black. Some states said if you look or even act Black, you're Black. Some said if you have 1/4 of a Black blood running through your veins, you're Black. Some states declared if you have one drop of Black blood, you are entirely Black. Now, those weren't official laws, but they were widely followed. As the instructions shown here, and I know you probably can't read them, but I wanted you to see this is actually from the instruction booklet to enumerators. And you will see here that the notion of blood was different for Negroes who were then called Negroes and then called Indians. The former were subject to the one drop rule, while blood quantum applied to American Indians. And indeed, for Negroes, it says any kind of mixture, then you're Black. For Indians, it said, should be regarded as Indian except where the percentage of Indian blood is very small or where he is regarded as white. On the next slide, you'll see some of the rationale for this. Legal scholar Tommy Miller, Confederate Tribes of the Colville Reservation, provides a detailed analysis of the history and complexity of blood quantum, noting that blood quantum laws were first used in the US to prevent mixed race people from holding public office or intermarrying with Europeans. Then some things changed, and in 1817, the federal government began using blood quantum in treaties to separate half-breeds from those with the lower blood quantum, conferring benefits only on the former. So thanks to my colleague, Gracie Redshirt Tayan, Ogala Lakota, for sharing this article with me and for explaining some of the complexities of American Indian identity, which the next slide begins to explain. American Indians weren't formally counted in the US Census until 1890. No words. Ms. Redshirt Tayan noted that vast differences exist in the over 560 tribal nations, including their constitutions and unique requirements for enrollment. In addition, she noted that there are over 300 federally recognized tribes, each having its own political, legal, police system, economy, land-based, language, religion, and sovereign authority. Thus, although American Indians often are described as if they are homogeneous, their identity is quite heterogeneous. The same can be said of Asian Americans, as shown in the next slide. So 20 million Asian Americans trace their roots to more than 20 countries in East and Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, each with unique histories, cultures, languages, and other characteristics. The US Asian population overall does well on measures of economic well-being compared with the US population as a whole, but this varies widely among Asian subgroups. Some have household incomes well below the median household income for all Americans. Therefore, it's dangerous when we look at certain data, and it's a challenge for all of us in terms of viewing data to disaggregate them and not try to lump everybody into one. The Asian population is actually growing faster than any other major racial or ethnic group, projected to become the largest immigrant group in the country, surpassing Hispanics in 2055. I hope this gives you a sense of how the Census Bureau's treatment of race is political and social, and also to see its relevance to power and racial inequities. I encourage you to delve more deeply. There's a wealth of information online from credible sources.